I picked up the Panasonic S5II. Does this mean I'm switching from Sony? Today we are looking at the Panasonic S5II. This is just an initial impressions and a little explainer why I went ahead and picked up one of these cameras. Ever since it was announced, I've been very intrigued by this camera, a very strong competitor to cameras like the Sony A7 IV. However, I didn't really have a need, nor did I really want to spend the money on another camera system. However, the other day, a friend of mine noticed that the price had massively dropped here in the UK. I was able to pick up one of these for just over £1,000, which is an amazing deal. Just a year ago when this camera was announced, it was around £2,000. It's been sitting around £1,600 here in the UK for the last 6 months or so, but with a couple of extra discounts from Panasonic, suddenly I was able to pick one of these up for £1,099. If I see any great deals like this again, I will definitely put it in my posts on my YouTube channel, so make sure you like and subscribe. So that's ultimately why I picked one of these up. It's the price. It's a great price. I really want to try out the system, and I needed a camera for my YouTubing. My Sony cameras get used all the time for work, and as great as that is, it's frustrating to have to constantly get it out of the bag just to do a shot. Now, I'm not saying everyone should just go out and do that. I'm not saying you should just go out and get cameras for single purposes like that. Obviously, I have an additional purpose here for me, but in most cases, you need to pick the right camera system for you. And that's what I'm hoping to discover as I use this camera more and more in the future. It's never really sensible to switch systems between different manufacturers unless you really have a good reason to switch. It is much better to invest in a particular lens type. If you do have loads of E-mount lenses, it doesn't make sense to suddenly jump ahead and go to Panasonic or Canon, whoever it may be, just because they have the latest and greatest. Those features, they're probably going to come to your camera system at some point in the future, but it is good to see what's out there. It's good to see what features are in this camera that I really want to see in my Sonys. So as I mentioned, this camera mainly for me is all about YouTube content creation. So it doesn't need certain features that I expect from, say, my Sony FX3, especially at the price I was able to pick this one up at. I'm really intrigued though to try things out like the open gate. Just from using it so far, I really like having that extra height in shots. I do wish it had the ability to do higher frame rates while shooting full frame. However, there is a little trick to that. If you're willing to shoot APS-C, there is the 3.3K mode. And it's great, it's cool to have that extra height, even though you're not using the full size of the sensor. I've not really seen anyone talk about this. I will certainly do plenty of comparisons and reviews looking at the 3.3K mode, because I think there's a lot of use cases where that could be really great. Of course, you've got the higher frame rates, which is really handy. And actually, if you already have APS-C size lenses, say the Sigma 18-35, this could be a great pairing with this camera if you still want to get that sort of open gate look. Doing so would still give you the advantages of being able to shoot both vertical and widescreen at the same time. But of course, you're saving loads on storage space because you're only shooting 3.3K versus 6K in the camera. Now, whether the quality is good enough, well, we'll have to judge that later on. I'll be doing a full review of that mode in the future because I am very intrigued about how well that could actually work. I see a lot of potential use for it, lots of corporate jobs where you don't necessarily need super high resolution, but they still want the different outputs from the same footage. And I think that could be where a 3.3K mode could be very exciting indeed. The stabilization on the Panasonic is legendary. I remember when I used to have the GH5, I really missed the stabilization that that camera had, especially when I'm shooting lots of B-roll. In fact, you can check out a whole video where I talk about how I go about making money just shooting B-roll with clients just up here if you are interested. And I think something like this could actually be very useful in that sort of world. I often shoot higher frame rates to compensate for the lack of stability in a camera, especially when the stabilization on certain cameras like the Sonys isn't that great. However, with the stabilization of Panasonic that we all know is excellent, and from playing around with it, it does look absolutely brilliant, even when shooting at normal frame rates, it could open up the possibility of using this once again for doing a lot of B-roll shoots, and I might actually end up shooting with this camera a lot more on professional shoots just for that reason alone. Also, so far, I really like the just user interface of the Panasonic camera. The viewfinder is amazing. It's a big improvement over the Sony's, especially the A7 IV, and the screen on the back, once again, is so much better than what you see on Sony cameras. I don't understand why Sony is so far behind when it comes to their screen and EVF tech compared to the competition, because there's a camera like this being able to produce such great results on the back. It's the same generation of camera, so there's no excuse really from Sony not to have great looking images. It helps a lot when you're composing a shot using just the basic camera, having a nice bright screen that is super sharp and just gives you confidence in how you shoot. Not just the actual quality of the screen either, just the interface and the layout of the screen also is a big upgrade with this camera over the Sony's. I really like the fact that you've got your information around the edge of the frame in small. Canon do this as well with their cinema line, and it just looks so much neater and tidier than the Sony interface, which does still look quite messy in comparison. I must admit, I am slightly confused by the S&Q mode on this camera. Things like the bit rates are very limited, so you can only do 420 for a lot of things, and I don't understand why you have such a limited selection. I guess it's the limitation of the speed that the processor and the SD cards can do, but you don't seem to get those limitations on the Sony cameras. So that's one frustration I've discovered with this camera already. I've only played around with a little bit of photography on this camera and it looks great. The autofocus seems to perform very well, especially with this Panasonic 24mm lens. I bought this lens, it's secondhand, and I just got it really as my main talking head camera. I felt like I needed a native lens for the system, for the very least for doing those pieces to camera. That said, this might be the only lens I will buy for this camera for now. Obviously, we'll look into other lens options and I may pick some other things up, but I have picked up the Sigma EF adapter because actually I have loads of Canon lenses that I'm really intrigued that I want to try with the S5II. From so far looking at it, the autofocus does work quite well with those cameras. It's a bit slower, of course, you'd expect that, but it is actually usable and does work, even though the lenses might be a little bit noisy compared to what they would be like on a native camera. Honestly, a lot of the time I'll probably end up using cine lenses with this camera as well. I just love using lenses like the DZO 35mm. I think it's just such a nice lens just to use as a lens, especially if you're doing sort of detail shots or getting any close-ups of things. Because of that smooth manual focus, it just gives you so much confidence. And of course, with the built-in stabilization of the S5II, there's no concerns about the wobble or shake that you may get from using such a small setup. The only other initial thing I've noticed with this camera that could be slightly frustrating is the position of the dial on the back here. It's very easy to knock and suddenly your shutter speed easily changes just by touching this. There should really be a lock on the back here to stop that from happening. Unfortunately, they haven't done that with this particular camera, but it'd be nice to see what that could be in the future. And actually, that's really a summary of what I'm hoping to see with this camera, is to learn the Panasonic system, see where they're heading with their whole ecosystem. Should we be excited about the next generation of Panasonic cameras? The more expensive ones, the more professional setups that really are going to compete with cameras like the Sony FX3. This is such a great position, this camera, at the low end. And actually, to be honest, at a price that I was able to pick one of these up for, I think it's really hard to beat. A hybrid camera that can do so much, a built-in fan, which is something I forgot to mention. That is such a useful thing to have in a camera like this. It means you can just go out there and shoot anything with full confidence in knowing that it's going to look great and you're not going to have any technical issues of overheating or anything else like that. Of course, there's always upgrades and features you could add onto a camera, and we'll talk about that more in the future. However, as a starting point, I think this is really great from Panasonic, and I am very excited to see what they do in the future. If you've already picked one of these up and you've owned one in the last year, let me know what you think of this camera. Have you had any frustrations if you've switched from a different system, or do you really love it? Do you think it's a great system to work on? And what should I be looking out for? Are there any big tips or tricks that I should be using with this camera? As I mentioned, I'll be doing plenty of videos talking about the S5II in terms of how I use it, that 3.3K open gate, as well as things like how it is for photography, working with EF lenses, and so much more. So if you want to see all of that, make sure you subscribe. I'll also be comparing it plenty to Sony cameras as well, such as the A7 IV, because that is the obvious comparison when it comes to this camera. If you've enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out my other reviews of other cameras, such as my beloved FX3, which has been my true workhorse in the last few years.